It was late September of 2018, and I decided to take a solo camping trip up to the Black Ridge area in Southern Oregon. I was 34 at the time and had been working long weeks in a Portland office doing software QA for a mid-sized tech firm. I needed to get out of the city and reset. I'd camped before, mostly with friends, but this was my first real solo trip. I chose Black Ridge because it was quiet, not too far from Medford in case I needed anything, and the Forest Service trails weren't overcrowded. It was also high enough to get crisp air, especially this time of year. The fall colors were just starting to come in, and the weather report said 3 days of clear skies, with lows in the 40s at night. I packed light but smart. A 2-person backpacking tent, a warm sleeping bag, a jet boil for hot meals, dehydrated food, water filtration gear, a compass, laminated maps, and enough layers to deal with the colder nights. I also had a flashlight, headlamp, backup batteries, a knife, bear spray, and a first aid kit. I left my GPS beacon behind because I wasn't planning on going more than 6 or 7 miles off the main logging roads, and cell coverage was spotty but not dead in the area. I parked off a forestry road at the trailhead and started hiking in around 10:30 a.m. on a Thursday. The weather was perfect. High 60s, sunny, and just the faintest wind stirring the pine trees. I saw no other cars at the lot, which made me feel good. I wasn't looking to be social. I wanted to hike, breathe clean air, and be alone with my thoughts for a couple of nights. The trail was well maintained. I hiked 5 miles in, stopping only to snack and drink water. I passed through a stretch of dense pine before reaching a more open plateau that looked west over a distant valley. I'd marked a small clearing near the base of a short ridge where a seasonal creek flowed in the spring. It was dry now but flat, with decent tree cover and enough space to pitch a tent well away from any game trails. No signs of animals other than some squirrel tracks and old deer scat nearby. I set up camp around 3 p.m., pitched my tent near the north edge of the clearing, and collected down branches to make a small fire later. After I unpacked and got things situated, I sat on a rock and just listened. The silence wasn't total. There were birds, a few insects, the sound of wind in the trees, but no man-made sounds at all. I didn't realize how much background noise city life had until it was gone. It was peaceful in a way I'd been craving. After a simple dinner of ramen and jerky, I settled in around 8:30 p.m. I didn't bother with a fire. The night came quickly in the woods. It dipped into the low 40s, but I stayed warm in the tent, reading for a bit with the headlamp before falling asleep. The first night went without any issues. I woke up a few times because the wind had picked up and branches tapped against each other, but nothing out of the ordinary. The next day, I did a long loop hike with a light pack, exploring more of the ridge and a higher overlook to the south. I found a small spring where I refilled my water with a filter and took photos of the sun breaking through the trees. I saw no other hikers, no boot prints on the trail, no litter. It felt like I had the whole area to myself. Back at camp that afternoon, I started a small fire just for the warmth and comfort of it, boiled water for another dehydrated meal, and ate while watching the light fade. I heard what I assumed was an elk bugling somewhere far off, but otherwise the forest was quiet. When it got dark, I put out the fire completely and tucked in. Again, the tent stayed warm, and I had no trouble sleeping. The third day is when things started to feel off. I woke up a little before dawn, maybe 5:45 a.m., needing to pee. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. It was cold, maybe high 30s, and there was light fog around the base of the trees. I walked a little away from the tent, did my business, and stood for a minute just watching the sky turn lighter. That's when I noticed something strange. Faint tracks in the dirt, just beyond the edge of my cleared area, heading toward the trees. They weren't mine. I had been careful about stepping in the same places, and there hadn't been any rain to soften or shift the ground. These were fresher. A single set boot prints, a size larger than mine. The pattern on the soles looked like a thick hiking tread, but not a brand I recognized. They came from the south, entered near the same dry creek bed I'd crossed 2 days before, then angled around my tent and disappeared back into the woods east of me. Not close enough to step on my gear, but close enough that someone had clearly walked through in the night or early morning while I was asleep. I stared at them for a while, My first thought was maybe I had missed another camper, someone doing a loop in the early hours, but the tracks made a tight arc, like they came to look at my site, then left without stopping. And I'd heard nothing. I'm a light sleeper when I'm out in the woods. A person stepping through dead leaves and pine needles within 50 feet of my tent should have woken me up. I walked the tracks as far as I could follow them, but they faded where the ground hardened near tree roots. There were no other signs, no trash, no broken branches, no markings. I checked around my camp. Nothing was moved or taken. Still, the feeling it left in me was sharp and cold. I debated leaving, packing up and heading back early, but I talked myself out of it. I'd brought a whistle, bear spray, a knife. Maybe it was just a hunter cutting through. Maybe someone who saw my campfire the night before and got curious. I didn't want to assume anything, but I stayed more alert that day. I skipped the long hike I had planned and stayed near camp, making a point to keep my pack ready and my spray nearby. By late afternoon, I'd mostly convinced myself it was nothing. I rebuilt my fire ring, gathered wood again, and made dinner. I still didn't hear or see anyone else. The forest was as quiet as ever. That night, I kept my headlamp within arm's reach and put a few stones near the tent door flap, just little pebbles that would shift if stepped on. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. Not from a sound at first. It was like something jolted me awake. A pressure, maybe, or a sixth sense. My heart was already racing. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening. That's when I heard it soft, slow crunching outside. Leaves. Deliberate. Not wind. Not an animal. Something stepping slowly through the woods. Then a pause. Then 2 more steps, closer. I didn't move. My mouth was dry. I reached for the bear spray and held it tightly, barely breathing. The sound came again, now right at the edge of my camp area, just feet away from the tent. Then silence. No movement, just the kind of quiet that screams in your ears when you're afraid. I lay there for what felt like an hour. My arm went numb from staying still. Eventually, the night sounds returned. A distant owl, the wind picking up again. I didn't hear the steps again, but I didn't fall back asleep either. I waited until first light, then got out of the tent as soon as it was bright enough to see. The pebbles I'd placed by the door were scattered. One had been stepped on, flattened into the soft dirt, and there were more tracks, the same boot pattern. This time they led directly to my tent and stopped just a few feet from the entrance. No other tracks, no circling. Whoever it was had walked straight to the tent, stood there, and left the way they came. I packed everything in under 10 minutes. I skipped breakfast. I didn't even roll up the tent, just stuffed it into the top of the pack, still half unzipped. I hiked out fast, pushing harder than I'd normally go with a full pack. I didn't stop once, not for water, not to rest. I made it back to my car in just under 2.5 hours. As soon as I reached the gravel lot, I looked around. No other vehicles. No sign anyone had been there. I threw my gear in the back and drove until I got cell service again. I didn't call the cops. I didn't really have anything to report. No confrontation, no damage, nothing taken. Just footprints and the deep, undeniable sense that someone had been watching me, moving through the forest with purpose. I didn't camp alone again for over 2 years after that. When I finally did, it was in a park closer to town with other people nearby. I told myself I'd been unlucky, that it was just a drifter or hunter or someone passing through. But it didn't sit right. Not then, not now. Who walks that quietly through the woods at 2 in the morning? Who circles a lone tent, comes back a second night, and leaves without saying a word? I'll never know the answer, and maybe that's for the best. I was 38 that year, and I had just come off a rough stretch of nonstop work. I'd been grinding through construction contracts for almost 9 months straight, trying to keep ahead of bills after the split with my ex. She took the house, and I didn't fight her on it. I just needed to keep moving, keep earning. But by the time September came around, my back hurt all the time, and my hands were stiff in the mornings. I was burned out. My buddy Jeff had told me about this place in northern Idaho, a cabin near Lake Pend Oreille, way off the beaten path, past Sandpoint. He'd stayed there a couple of years earlier, said it was peaceful, dead quiet, surrounded by nothing but trees. That's exactly what I needed. No people, no phones, no traffic, just trees, water, and time to sit still for once. The place was old, owned by some guy named Arnold who lived out in Washington and rented it for dirt cheap as long as you didn't mind a little dust and the occasional squirrel getting into the attic. I didn't. I packed up my gear, loaded some canned food, a couple coolers with sandwich meat and water, and headed out. I didn't even tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I was taking a break for a couple weeks. The drive from Spokane took about 3.5 hours. The roads got thinner the farther north I went, and by the time I turned off onto the narrow dirt path Arnold had marked in the instructions, I was already out of cell service. The air smelled like pine and wet dirt. I followed the road slowly, avoiding potholes and thick roots that had pushed up through the packed earth. It felt like I was going nowhere for the longest time. Just endless forest and the crunch of gravel under the tires. Eventually, I reached the clearing. The cabin sat in a small patch of grass, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees, their leaves already starting to turn yellow. It wasn't big, just a single-story structure with a wide porch out front and a tin chimney poking out the top. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in a while, which was fine by me. I didn't need fancy, just quiet. I parked a few feet away, grabbed my bag, and walked up the creaking porch steps. The key was under a rusted coffee can, just like Arnold had said. Inside, the place smelled musty, but not bad. Just that old wood smell you get from places that sit empty too long. There were 2 rooms, a main living area with a small wood stove, a kitchen counter, and a worn couch, and a back room with a bed and a single window looking out into the trees. I spent the first couple hours airing the place out and getting set up. The windows opened, but they were stiff and I had to force a few. There was no electricity, just some oil lamps and a pile of chopped wood stacked next to the stove. I checked the cabinets. A few mice had gotten into them, but otherwise it was clean. I dumped my food into a cooler in the shade outside and unpacked my clothes. That night, I lit the stove and sat on the porch in a camping chair with a flashlight and a book, listening to the wind and the soft creak of the trees around me. It was perfect. The first few days were the best sleep I'd had in years. I woke up to birds instead of trucks or sirens. I spent mornings hiking around the lake, fishing off the rocks, or just lying in the grass doing nothing. My back started to loosen up, and the constant noise in my head began to quiet down. I didn't keep track of the days. I didn't care. Then, around the 5th or 6th night, things started to feel off. I remember waking up suddenly just after midnight. The room was dark except for the soft red glow from the stove in the other room. I didn't know why I woke up at first. There wasn't a sound. No wind. No animals. Just dead silence. That kind of silence you don't get in the city. I lay still, breathing slow, trying to figure out what had disturbed me. It wasn't a nightmare. I hadn't been dreaming. It was like my body knew something I didn't. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and walked out into the main room. The fire had burned down low. I added a couple logs and checked the front door. It was locked. The windows were all shut. Nothing looked moved, but the feeling didn't go away. It sat in my chest like pressure, like when a storm's about to hit and the air gets heavy. I sat on the couch for a while, trying to shake it off. Eventually, I went back to bed, but it took a long time to fall asleep. The next day, I went farther into the woods than I had before. There was an old logging trail that cut east from the lake, and I followed it a couple miles in. The trees were thicker out there. I didn't see any animals, not even birds, just quiet, and that wasn't normal. At one point, I stopped to tie my boot, and I could swear I heard something snap, like a branch underfoot, maybe 30 or 40 feet into the trees. I stood still, listening, but nothing followed. I chalked it up to nerves and kept walking. When I got back to the cabin late that afternoon, I noticed something odd. The door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I always double-checked, especially out here. Nothing was missing inside, but one of the oil lamps was on the floor. Not broken, just lying there sideways. I didn't remember leaving it like that. Again, I tried to tell myself I had made a mistake. Maybe I was tired or distracted. But that old feeling came back, that pressure, that quiet. like the trees were holding their breath. I started sleeping with the hatchet next to the bed after that, just in case. I told myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe a raccoon had figured out the door latch, though that didn't make much sense. I even set up a small string tied to the door handle with a spoon on it, so if anything opened it, I'd hear it fall. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of the spoon hitting the floor. I froze. My eyes were wide open before I even knew I was awake. There was no wind, no storm, just the soft clatter of the metal spoon on wood. Then nothing. I didn't move right away. I just lay there, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my arms. After maybe 30 seconds, I sat up and grabbed the flashlight. I clicked it on and opened the bedroom door slowly. The main room was empty. The door was cracked open about 3 inches. The spoon lay on the floor right where I had expected, but nothing else was touched. The lamp still sat on the table. The fire had burned low again. I stepped outside into the cold, aiming the flashlight into the trees. Nothing, just endless black trunks and darkness. I turned in a slow circle, listening, but all I heard was my own breathing. I shut the door, locked it again, and pushed the couch in front of it. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I checked for tracks. The dirt outside the porch was packed hard, but I thought I saw something near the edge of the trees. It wasn't clear, just a soft indent like a boot print, but it didn't have enough detail to be sure. I told myself it could have been mine from before, but I wasn't convinced. I didn't go hiking that day. I spent it sitting on the porch, watching the tree line. The following night, it happened again. This time, I didn't hear the spoon fall. I just woke up, same as before, feeling that weight in the air. I walked out, and the door was open again, wider this time, maybe 6 inches. The couch had been nudged slightly, not pushed aside, but moved, just enough to let the door open a crack. The fire had been out for hours. I took the flashlight and stepped outside barefoot, staying on the porch. I didn't go more than 2 steps. I scanned the trees. I was shaking. Every sound felt louder, sharper. I was breathing too fast. Then I saw something, movement, about 20 feet out. Not an animal, not a bear or deer, person. They were standing between 2 trees, barely visible, but there, not moving. No flashlight, no gear, just a dark outline standing still, watching me. I didn't speak. I just backed into the cabin, slammed the door, and locked it. I pushed the couch back in place and dragged the table over too. I didn't sleep. I sat with the hatchet in my lap until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I packed everything. I shoved my gear into the bag, left the food, didn't care. I didn't even check the back room. I just got out. The drive back felt like a dream. Every bump in the road made me jump. I didn't stop until I hit Sandpoint. I sat in a gas station parking lot for half an hour, just breathing. Then I got coffee and drove the rest of the way back to Spokane. When I got home, I locked every window, every door, and didn't sleep for 2 days. I don't know who it was. I'll never know. And that's the worst part. They didn't steal anything. They didn't try to talk or break in loudly. They just stood there, came into the cabin when I was asleep, watched, listened, maybe more. I told myself I'd report it, but what could I say? I didn't have a name, no photo, no evidence, just a feeling, a sound, a door slowly opening, a shadow in the trees. I never went back. I never will. And I always lock every door now, twice. I was 34 when I decided to take some time away from everything. Work had been wearing me thin, and after almost a decade in Chicago, the city noise started to get under my skin in a way I hadn't expected. My name's Tom Russell. I worked in marketing back then, but the burnout hit hard that year, 2022, early fall. I needed quiet, somewhere far enough from people where I didn't have to think or be anyone for a little while. A friend of a friend had a cabin up in northern Idaho, not far from Priest Lake. Said it was empty most of the year, and I could use it for as long as I needed. That sounded perfect. The cabin was about 12 miles off the nearest highway, sitting in the thick woods, surrounded by pine and cedar. The closest town was Coolin, and even that was a good drive out. I stocked up on food, filled my truck with supplies, and made the trip up in early October, just as the trees were beginning to lose their leaves. That drive into the woods felt like I was peeling away layers of the world. No cell signal, no traffic, just gravel roads narrowing the deeper I went. It was peaceful, like I was being swallowed by the forest. When I pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly like the kind of place you'd imagine for something like this, old, but kept up. One story, made of faded logs with a pitched green roof and a small porch out front. It had a single bedroom, a kitchen with a wood stove, and a small living room with a couple old chairs and a stone fireplace. No TV, no internet. The power came from a generator out back, and water was pulled from a nearby well. It was the kind of place that forces you to slow down. The first few days were uneventful. I spent time hiking the trails around the property, making simple meals, reading. The quiet out there had a weight to it, thick and unbroken except for the wind and the sound of branches moving. Nights came early, and it got cold fast. I'd keep the fire going most evenings, listening to the crackle of burning wood, the distant hoot of an owl, and nothing else. I started writing in a notebook, just thoughts at first, little journal entries. I hadn't done anything like that since college. Something about being that isolated made me want to get things down on paper. That's how I remember the order of things, looking back, day by day, entry by entry. It was the fifth night when I first noticed something strange. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, not from a sound, but from a feeling. You know that sense you get when you're being watched? That heavy awareness? That's what pulled me from sleep. The cabin was silent. The fire had burned down low, and everything was still. I sat up in bed and waited, not really sure what I was expecting. I didn't hear anything. Eventually, I chalked it up to nerves and went back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and walked the perimeter, just out of curiosity. The ground was soft with pine needles and some early frost, but nothing looked out of place. There were a few animal tracks, maybe a deer or something smaller. I figured maybe I'd been dreaming. That happens out there with no light pollution and complete silence. You start to fill the void with your own thoughts. But then it happened again the next night. I woke up around the same time, 2 a.m., but this time, I heard something. Not footsteps exactly, but a shift in pressure, a dull thud, like weight on a wooden step. I stayed still, straining to hear more, but it didn't repeat. After a long while, I got out of bed and looked through the front window. The porch was empty. I stayed up for a few hours after that, just sitting in the dark with a flashlight in hand, listening. By day 7, I was uneasy. The woods no longer felt as welcoming. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder during hikes. Every time I went out, I had this tight feeling in my gut, like something was just out of sight. I found myself coming back to the cabin earlier and earlier, locking the door behind me even though I was miles from the nearest person. That night, I woke again. This time, I heard a definite sound. A scrape, metal on wood, came from the side of the cabin, near the window. I sat up fast, heart pounding. It was pitch dark, but the fire still had some glow. I grabbed my flashlight and stood still, barely breathing. The scraping stopped. I moved toward the front of the cabin slowly, then heard another sound, something tapping against the wall. Not hard, but deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't open the door. I waited. After maybe a minute, it stopped. Nothing followed. I stayed up the rest of the night, light on, eyes fixed on the window. The next morning, I went outside and circled the cabin. On the north wall, near the bedroom window, I found marks, scratches, fresh, long, and shallow. It looked like someone had dragged something sharp across the logs. Not an animal. I knew the difference. These weren't claw marks. They were too clean, too intentional. Like someone had done it slowly, just to mess with me. That day, I walked further out into the woods, searching for signs. Boot prints, a trail, anything. I didn't find much, but about 200 yards east of the cabin, I came across something that stopped me cold. A small clearing with a fire pit recently used, blackened wood, scorched earth, and something else half buried in the dirt, a food wrapper, the same kind I had in the cabin. I hadn't left any outside. I was sure of it. I took it as a warning. Someone had been watching me, possibly coming near the cabin at night. I packed a bag that evening, planning to head back to town the next morning. But part of me didn't want to leave in the dark. I figured if I could hold out until sunrise, I'd drive out and be done with the whole thing. That night was the worst. Around midnight, the generator cut off. That had never happened before. I stepped outside to check it and immediately felt like something was wrong. The air was colder than usual, the woods too quiet. No wind, no insects, no distant rustle of animals. Just complete silence. The generator looked fine, no leaks, still had gas. I restarted it and went back inside, locking the door again. Maybe 5 minutes later, I heard a knock. Not on the door, on the window. Just one. A soft, single knock. Then another, from the back of the cabin. Then one from the side. Different windows, one after the other. My skin went cold. I didn't have a gun, just a hatchet and a kitchen knife. I stood in the middle of the room, clutching the flashlight in one hand, hatchet in the other, trying to listen. The knocking stopped. Then footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy. Whoever it was stood there for a long time. I didn't move. The door didn't rattle. No attempt to get in. Just that weight of presence. Eventually, the footsteps receded. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, shaking, until the first light broke through the trees. I left as soon as the sun was up, throwing my gear in the truck without breakfast. I didn't even lock the cabin. I just got in and drove, watching the tree line in the rearview mirror the entire time. I didn't report it to the police. What could I say? Someone scratched my cabin and knocked on my windows? There was no real crime, just a feeling, a presence. Predator circling, watching. A few days later, I got a call from the friend who owned the place. I asked him casually if anyone else had been out there recently. He said no, not since last winter. I didn't mention what happened. I just told him I left early, needed to get back to the city. It's been over 2 years, and I haven't gone back to any cabin since. I still think about that night, though. Sometimes I wake up at 2 a.m., heart racing, thinking I heard a tap on the window. I've changed apartments twice since then, and I keep a baseball bat near my bed. I don't think whoever it was wanted to hurt me, at least not that night. I think they just liked watching, waiting. Maybe they were planning something. Maybe they were testing how long I'd last. Maybe if I'd stayed one more night, they would have come inside. But I didn't stay, and I'll never go back to that cabin again. The night was cold, and the wind had a sharpness to it, making the leaves rustle in an eerie way. I had always enjoyed camping, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the isolation of the campsite, far from the usual crowd, or the fact that I had come alone this time. But as I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest around me seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional distant call of a bird or animal. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it was just my imagination, but it lingered. I had set up my tent earlier that afternoon, a simple 2-person tent that I had used many times before. My gear was scattered around the site: sleeping bag, backpack, a few cans of food. Everything seemed fine, but the longer I sat there, the more I became aware of the silence around me. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence either. It was thick and heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. I glanced at the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. The shadows they cast were long and twisting, stretching across the forest floor like dark fingers. I couldn't help but imagine what could be lurking in those shadows, even though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, the feeling of unease gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. As the fire burned low, I decided to get into my tent. The wind had picked up, and the night felt even colder now. I zipped up the tent and settled into my sleeping bag, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling. The sounds of the forest continued, but it felt like they were getting closer, like the trees were whispering secrets just out of reach. I tried to sleep, but it wasn't easy. The sound of the wind howling through the trees kept me awake, along with the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Every now and then, I would hear something that sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps, but when I checked, there was nothing there. My nerves were starting to fray, but I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer or some other animal. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside, and the sunlight had already begun to filter through the trees. I felt relieved, like the worst of the night had passed. I decided to take a walk through the woods, stretch my legs a bit, and clear my head. I packed a small snack and a bottle of water into my backpack, strapped it on, and left the campsite. The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees and underbrush. The forest here was dense, and I could barely see the sky through the canopy of leaves above. I walked for a while, enjoying the solitude. It was peaceful, and the quiet of the forest seemed almost comforting in the daylight. But the further I walked, the more something felt off again. It wasn't like the previous night. There was no immediate danger, no clear threat. It was just a feeling, a sense that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was nearby, watching me from the shadows. I paused several times, turning to look behind me, but saw nothing, just the trees, the rocks, and the underbrush. I continued on, trying to ignore the feeling, until I came across something odd. It was a small clearing, not much bigger than a few yards across, and in the center of it was a pile of rocks. It looked like it had been carefully arranged, not like a natural formation. The rocks were stacked in a way that felt intentional, almost as if they were marking something. I stepped closer, curiosity getting the better of me. As I crouched down to inspect the pile, I noticed something strange. Tucked between two of the rocks was a small piece of cloth, frayed at the edges. I picked it up, and it felt odd, almost like fabric that had been weathered by time. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned it over in my hands, and that's when I saw it. Something carved into the rock beneath the cloth. It was faint, but it looked like a symbol, a sort of jagged pattern that didn't seem like anything I recognized. It wasn't like any typical trail marker, and it certainly wasn't a natural shape. It almost looked like a warning. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the unease grow in the pit of my stomach. I stood up quickly, brushing off the feeling that had crept up on me. I was starting to feel like maybe it was time to leave, but curiosity pushed me to keep exploring. After all, I had come out here to get away from everything, to clear my mind, not to turn back just because of a strange symbol. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around, scanning the trees, but everything was still. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily quiet again. I shrugged it off and made my way back toward the trail, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. I reached my campsite by midday, and for the first time in a long while, I felt grateful for the sight of my tent and fire pit. I set down my pack and sat down, trying to push away the feeling of being followed. I glanced around nervously, wondering if I was just imagining things. I had no reason to believe I was in danger, but my instincts told me something wasn't right. I spent the afternoon keeping busy, gathering firewood, checking my gear, and even preparing some food. But as the evening approached and the sun began to dip behind the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in around me. It was like the trees had grown taller and the shadows deeper. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Night fell and I lit the fire again. The crackling flames provided some comfort, but I was still uneasy. I sat there for a while, staring into the fire, listening to the wind, trying to ignore the odd noises that seemed to surround me. It was probably just animals moving through the underbrush, I told myself. There was no need to worry. But then I heard something else, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't a whisper at all. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone walking around the campsite. I froze, staring into the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps weren't like animal tracks. They were too heavy, too purposeful. I jumped to my feet, scanning the area, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, just the shadows and the trees. The wind howled again, but the footsteps, those slow, heavy steps, continued. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, my hands shaking. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. No one was there. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe there was someone out there. But something in the pit of my stomach told me that whatever it wasn't friendly. I backed away from the fire, moving closer to my tent, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. I stayed there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, and hoping whatever it was would leave. Finally, the footsteps stopped. The forest went silent again, and the air seemed to shift. The tension lifted, and I allowed myself to relax just a little. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe I just needed a good night's sleep. But as I crawled into my tent, I kept the flashlight on and the zipper halfway open, just in case. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing heart, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The wind had died down again, and the world outside was quiet. My eyes drifted shut, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still out there. The night passed without incident, and when I woke up in the morning, the campsite was still. There was no sign of anyone or anything strange. I packed up quickly, not wanting to stay in the area any longer. I didn't know if it had been a trick of the mind or if something had really been out there, but either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. As I walked back down the trail to the parking lot, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The woods had their mysteries, but some things were better left unexplored. When I reached my car and drove away, I looked back one last time at the forest, the place where I had felt so uneasy. But I had survived the night, and that was enough for me. I promised myself I would come back, just not alone. The next day, when I got home, I went through my gear, checking for anything I might have missed. It was then that I found something strange. A small stone in the pocket of my jacket. It was smooth, round, and cold to the touch. I had no idea how it had gotten there, but as I held it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with the strange events of the night before. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me wonder if I had really been alone in those woods after all. I didn't plan the trip very well, and I'll be the first to admit that. I wanted to get away for a weekend and clear my head, and I picked a random area in the state I'd never been to before. A quiet patch of forest somewhere near the base of the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania. I don't remember the exact name of the trailhead, but I found it on a hiking forum, and it had just enough information to feel legit without looking touristy. It sounded like what I wanted. No crowds, no campsites, no rules. Just trees, dirt, and time to be alone. I packed my gear on a Thursday night, slept maybe 3 hours, and drove out early the next morning with a thermos of stale coffee and a half-eaten breakfast burrito from a gas station I don't think I could find again if I tried. I got to the trailhead a little after 10 in the morning. It was a cracked gravel lot with a rusted metal sign and no cars. I remember that specifically, no cars at all. It was quiet in a way that makes you stop and notice it. No birdsong, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on gravel and the low ticking sound of my cooling engine. I shut the car off, left the keys buried under the floor mat just in case something happened to me and someone needed to find them, and started the hike in. I had everything I needed: tent, water filter, freeze-dried food, matches, a knife, a basic med kit, a paper map I printed at home, and my old hiking pack with the right weight balance. I've done enough solo trips to know what can go wrong. I thought I was ready for anything. The hike in was uneventful for the first couple of hours. The trail wasn't marked, but the path was visible if you paid attention. Mostly just a flattened corridor through the trees, winding gently uphill. I walked for maybe 3 hours at a steady pace before I decided to start looking for a place to set up camp. I wanted to be far enough from the car that I wouldn't hear any sounds from the road, and this seemed like the perfect spot. I found a flat, elevated patch of ground just off the trail, partially surrounded by a thicket of young pines. Good natural windbreak, close to a small creek maybe 30 feet downhill. The sun was out but filtered through the trees, and everything smelled like damp leaves and pine needles. I dropped my pack, stretched, and started setting up the tent. It was one of those lightweight two-pole kinds, quick to pitch and solid if staked down right. I took my time with it, making sure everything was taut. I collected firewood for later and filtered some water from the creek. I remember the water was clear and freezing cold, and I knelt there for a while just watching it run past the rocks, listening to the soft rush of it. For a few hours, it felt exactly like I'd wanted, peaceful, still, like the rest of the world had shut off. That changed later around dusk. It started with the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in a supernatural way, nothing dramatic like that. Just a slow, creeping sensation like I was being watched. I brushed it off at first. It happens sometimes when you're alone in the woods for too long. Your brain starts to play tricks on you, fills in silence with paranoia. But then I noticed something that made me stop pretending it was just in my head. There were fresh tracks on the trail. Not boot prints, bare feet, human feet, medium-sized, going the opposite direction from where I'd come. The mud was still wet in the depressions, not dry and cracked like mine were. I followed them for a few feet with my eyes before they disappeared into the underbrush. No path, no direction, just straight off the trail and into the woods. I stood there for a while, listening. Nothing. No twigs snapping, no animals, no voice. I looked up at the sky, then back at the prints, then back toward my camp. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was already late, and I didn't want to hike in the dark. I told myself someone else must have come out here. Maybe a forager, someone off-grid, or even another camper who preferred walking barefoot. Strange, sure, but not impossible. I went back to camp and lit a fire, even though I didn't plan to. I thought it might help settle my nerves. I boiled water, made some food, and sat there watching the flames dance while the light slowly died behind the trees. The night settled in hard and fast. The stars came out, and the temperature dropped quick. I layered up, zipped into my bag, and tried to sleep. I woke up to the sound of branches cracking somewhere close. Not like a squirrel or raccoon. Heavier. 2 short cracks, then silence. I stayed completely still. The fire had died down to glowing coals, and everything was dark except for the faint red light from the embers. I couldn't see anything outside the tent, but I knew someone was out there. I could hear breathing, not an animal sniffing around. Breathing, human, slow, controlled, like someone trying to be quiet. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent or grab my knife or turn on my flashlight. I just lay there listening, heart thudding so hard I thought it would give me away. The breathing stayed steady for a while, then faded. Not suddenly, just slowly got quieter until I couldn't hear it anymore. I waited another hour before I even moved. When I finally unzipped the tent and looked out, there was nothing. No tracks, no shapes in the trees. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten. That morning, I found something that changed everything. On a low branch near the creek, tied loosely with what looked like vines, was a strip of fabric. Dark, reddish-brown, could have been part of a shirt or pants. It was frayed and stained. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a long time. It hadn't been there the day before. I would have seen it. I'm sure of that. I went back to the tent and packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't refill my water. I just got my gear together and started hiking back down the trail. I checked my map a few times to stay on track, but the trail seemed off, like the turns weren't quite where they were supposed to be. I kept moving anyway. About 2 hours into the hike, I found something that stopped me cold. A shelter. Not a real one, something handmade. Just a few thick branches leaned against a tree trunk and covered in dried pine needles and bark. It wasn't obvious. I only noticed it because a squirrel darted across the trail and disappeared into it. I looked inside. There was nothing in there. No bedding, no gear. But it had been used. The ground inside was packed flat. And around the edges, almost hidden by leaves, were small piles of bones. Animal bones, mostly, but one looked too long, too straight. I didn't stay to figure out what it was. I backed out, turned around, and kept walking. The trail kept feeling unfamiliar, like it shifted when I wasn't looking. Trees that I'd passed before looked different in the light. Some stumps I was sure I'd seen on the way in were missing. I stopped trusting my memory. I started checking my compass every few minutes. The direction stayed consistent, at least. South, toward the trailhead. I kept moving. Sometime in the afternoon, I found my own boot prints. The ones I'd made the day before. But they weren't right. They were mixed with more barefoot tracks. Too many, overlapping, going in all directions. It looked like someone had been following me, watching where I walked, maybe even stepping where I stepped. I wanted to run, but I knew better. Running just leads to mistakes. So I walked, as fast as I could without making noise, checking behind me every few steps. When I finally saw the parking lot again, I almost cried. My car was still there. The sun was low, sky tinged with orange. I ran the last 50 feet, heart hammering, and yanked open the driver's side door. The inside was exactly how I left it. I didn't check the back seat. I just started the engine and peeled out, gravel spraying behind me. I drove for an hour before I pulled over at a gas station. I checked the whole car. Nothing. No one. No signs of anyone having been inside. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a while. I didn't want to sound crazy. It was weeks before I went back to the woods again, and even then, I stuck to busy trails. I never found that forum post again. The trailhead disappeared from my saved pages. I don't know if it was deleted or if I imagined it differently, but I know I wasn't alone out there. Someone lives in those woods. Maybe not on any map, maybe not someone you'd ever meet in a town, but someone with bare feet and quiet breathing. Someone who watches. And that strip of fabric is in a plastic bag in the bottom drawer of my desk. I don't know why I took it. I didn't touch it with my hands. I used a stick. Maybe I needed proof. A reminder. I haven't been back to that part of the state. I probably never will. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night and it's dead silent, I think I hear breathing again. Slow, measured, just outside the window. I get up. I check. There's never anything there, but I still check. Every time. It was the last week of September when I took time off from work and decided to go on a solo camping trip in the northern woods of Michigan. I had been stressed out for months, just working long days at the warehouse, dealing with people, traffic, noise, everything piling up on me. I didn't want to go somewhere touristy or flashy. I wanted to go somewhere quiet and isolated, where I could hear myself breathe, maybe fish a little, sit by the fire, and just reset my brain. I picked a spot I found online, a remote lake near the Upper Peninsula, barely marked on any map, surrounded by thick forest and only accessible by an old logging trail. The few reviews I found talked about how peaceful it was and how you were unlikely to see anyone else for days. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, fishing rod, a cooler, fire starter, a few knives, a small hatchet, 2 flashlights, extra batteries, and my old .22 rifle. I never really expected to use it, but I always brought it just in case I ran into a bear or something. The weather was supposed to be clear, maybe a little chilly at night, but nothing too harsh. I left early that morning, got coffee at a gas station on the way, and drove 5 hours north. The further I got, the fewer cars I saw. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road, and after about 30 minutes of slow, bumpy driving, I reached the trailhead. The parking area was just a flat patch of dirt with enough space for maybe 2 cars. There weren't any other vehicles there. I parked, double-checked my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown in places and barely visible in others. It wound through thick woods for about 3 miles until I reached the lake. It was just as beautiful as I'd imagined. The water was still and black, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees. No signs of people, no sound but the breeze and birds. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, where the ground was flat and covered in pine needles. I had a good view of the water and enough distance from the trees to be safe from falling branches. After setting everything up, I gathered wood and built a fire pit with stones. I cooked some sausages over the flames and ate as the sun dipped behind the trees, turning the lake orange. That night, I slept harder than I had in months. Just the sound of leaves and crickets outside, the cold air pressing against the sides of the tent, and nothing else. The next 2 days were the same kind of peaceful. I spent my time walking around the lake, fishing, reading, and just sitting still. I didn't bring my phone except for emergencies, and I left it off most of the time. I saw deer once, drinking at the far side of the lake, and watched a bald eagle skim across the water. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize how noisy your life usually is. On the third night, something felt a little off. I had gone to sleep like usual, after eating and tending the fire until it burned down to coals. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, not suddenly, just kind of slowly becoming aware that I was awake. There wasn't any sound, not even the usual rustling or insects. I thought maybe I'd just been dreaming, but I had that odd feeling you get when your instincts are trying to tell you something. I stayed still for a long time, listening. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finally unzipped the tent quietly and stuck my head out. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of the trees, and the lake was smooth like glass. I waited, staring at the woods, trying to pick out any movement, but everything looked still. I figured it was just my imagination and went back inside, but I left my boots near the zipper in case I needed to get out quickly. It took me a while to fall back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately noticed something strange. There were small marks in the dirt near the fire pit. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, maybe raccoons or something, but they didn't look quite right. They were shallow, narrow, and came in from the woods. They stopped about 10 feet from the tent and then went back the way they came. I crouched down and studied them for a while, trying to figure out what made them. The shape wasn't right for deer or coyotes, and they were too far apart for smaller animals. They looked almost like the indentations of shoes, but not deep enough to be from someone walking normally. I brushed it off. Maybe it was an animal I wasn't familiar with. Maybe the ground was just soft in places and made weird shapes. I kept telling myself not to let my imagination get carried away. Still, I couldn't get that feeling out of my head, that sense of being watched. That day, I went for a longer hike, trying to shake off the unease. I circled the lake, taking my time, looking for signs of other people or anything unusual. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I didn't even see any birds, which felt strange. Normally, you'd hear at least the occasional woodpecker or squirrel. It was like everything had packed up and left. I got back to camp around 5 p.m. and rebuilt the fire. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling jumpy. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I cooked some food and ate fast, and by the time the sun went down, I was already on edge. I made sure everything was locked up in the bear canister and pulled into the tent early. I lay there in my sleeping bag, flashlight in my hand, rifle next to me, just staring at the ceiling of the tent. Around midnight, I heard it. A single footstep outside. Just one. The kind of sound someone makes when they step on a branch and break it under their weight. Not a crash, not a bunch of movement, just one deliberate, quiet snap. I didn't move. My heart started racing, and my ears strained to pick up any follow-up noise. But there was nothing. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then I heard a faint shuffle, like something brushing against the edge of the tent, down near my feet. I didn't even breathe. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. My other hand was slowly moving toward the rifle. I wrapped my fingers around it and waited. Every muscle in my body was locked. Another few minutes passed. Then silence again. I stayed like that for at least an hour, barely blinking. I don't think I slept at all. Eventually, the sky started to lighten outside, and I felt safe enough to move. I unzipped the tent slowly and crawled out. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were boot prints all around my tent. Human boot prints. They circled the whole thing. Some passed close by the fire pit, others led toward the woods. There were at least a dozen different impressions in the pine needles and dirt, and they weren't mine. I checked. My boots were still inside the tent, dry and clean. I hadn't walked around that night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. Then I walked toward the trees, trying to follow them. They led about 20 feet into the woods and then just vanished. The pine needles made it hard to track, and I couldn't tell where the person had come from or gone. But someone had definitely been there, watching me. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly. Just jammed everything into my pack. I kept the rifle in my hands the whole time. When I was ready, I started hiking back down the trail, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods were still too quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. About halfway back to my truck, I noticed something else. A broken tree branch hanging low over the trail, about chest height, that hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been snapped intentionally and bent across the path. I stepped over it and kept moving. Another 100 yards down, I saw a pile of small rocks stacked in the middle of the trail that hadn't been there either. Someone was following me, or maybe they'd been ahead of me. I picked up the pace, trying not to run but moving fast. I gripped the rifle tighter, constantly scanning the trees. The last half mile felt like it took an hour. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost broke into a sprint. The truck was untouched. I got in, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I just drove. The tires skidded a little on the dirt as I pulled out, and I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road. It took me a few hours to fully calm down. I stopped at a diner about 50 miles south and sat there with a cup of coffee, trying to make sense of everything. The prints, the noise, the rearranged trail. None of it made sense unless someone had been out there, watching me, messing with me. But why? There was nothing valuable in my camp. No one had taken anything. They could have hurt me, but they didn't. They just watched. When I got home, I didn't unpack right away. I left everything in the garage and sat in the living room with the curtains closed. For days, I kept thinking about those boot prints and the sound of that single footstep outside my tent. I checked local news for anything about missing people or strange reports near that lake. But there was nothing. I didn't report it to the police. What would I even say? I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about it sometimes. About how far away that place was, how quiet it was, how whoever was out there knew I was alone. I think that's what gets me the most. They knew I was by myself. They knew exactly where I was. I'm writing this down because I've realized I never want to go back to a place like that again. Not just that cabin, but the whole idea of being out there alone. I used to think I needed isolation to think straight. I thought it would help me reset, clear my mind. But after that weekend at Split Birch Cabin, I learned that some things are better dealt with among people. Back in 2021, I was 34, living in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I had a job in software, freelance stuff mostly, so I could work from anywhere. I had gone through a rough year, lost my dad to a heart attack in February, and then a few months later, my relationship ended after 5 years. I needed a break from everything, and being around people just made it worse. Everyone had advice, but none of it felt helpful. That fall, I rented a small off-grid cabin in upstate New York, about 4 hours north of Albany. It was tucked away in the foothills of the Adirondacks, not far from Lake Harris, but not near any tourist trail either. The listing described it as perfect for solo retreats, solar power, a gravity-fed water system, and a wood stove for heat. It was surrounded by forest, with no cell signal and no neighbors for at least 3 miles. The nearest town, Newcomb, had a population under 500. The owner was an older guy named Ron who had converted an old hunting shack into something more livable. He met me in town at a diner parking lot, handed me a printed map, showed me where to turn off the highway, and then just said to follow the dirt path until I saw the split birch tree. The cabin would be just behind it. The drive from the diner to the cabin took nearly 40 minutes, the last stretch crawling along a barely visible trail. When I finally saw that forked birch tree, I was relieved. The cabin sat about 20 feet behind it, weathered pine siding, a tin roof that had seen better days, and one small window on each side. It didn't look like much, but it was solid. One room, a small porch, a fire pit, and an outhouse maybe 30 yards into the woods. It was late October, cold enough to see your breath in the mornings, but the snow hadn't started yet. The woods were mostly bare, the leaves having just dropped, so everything had that dead quiet that only fall brings. I liked it at first, the stillness, the kind of silence you only get when you're miles from anything. The first day, I unpacked, stacked some firewood beside the stove, set up my sleeping bag on the built-in cot, and made a quick dinner from canned soup. I had brought enough food for a week, mostly dry stuff, cans, a few fresh vegetables I planned to eat early. There was a manual pump for water in a small shed beside the cabin, and the tap ran cold and clean. That first night, I sat out on the porch under a thick blanket, sipping instant coffee from a thermos, listening to the wind. I remember thinking how right this felt. Just me and the woods. No phone, no one to talk to. I fell asleep quickly, the kind of sleep that hits you hard when there's no background noise. Just the creak of trees and the occasional rustle of animals. The second day, I hiked around the area to get my bearings. I didn't have GPS, but I had a compass and the printed map Ron had given me. I stayed within a mile of the cabin, following some game trails, checking out the streams. At one point, I thought I heard a low engine rumble, maybe an ATV or chainsaw, but it was so faint it could have been anything. I chalked it up to sound traveling strangely in the forest. That night, I woke up twice to noises outside. Sharp ones like a stick snapping, then something dragging across the ground. I sat up, heart thumping, and reached for my flashlight. The stove had burned low, and the cabin was cold. I peeked out the window and scanned the woods, but the beam caught nothing but trunks and shadows. Probably a raccoon or deer. I wasn't really scared. Not yet, but I did start locking the door after that, even though it was just a simple latch. By the third day, things began to feel a little off. I found boot prints in the dirt about 10 yards behind the cabin. They weren't mine. I had a very distinct tread on my hiking boots, and these were different. Heavier, wider set. I told myself it could have been Ron checking up on the place, though it didn't make much sense for him to hike in that far just to snoop around the back. Still, I had no real reason to be alarmed, so I let it go. That afternoon, while chopping wood, I noticed something strange further out, about 50 yards through the trees, something reflective glinting on the ground. I walked over and found a crumpled energy drink can, partially buried in the leaves. It wasn't mine. I hadn't brought any drinks like that. The label was faded, but the aluminum looked recent, no rust, no weathering. I carried it back and tossed it into my trash bag. Probably some hiker from earlier in the season, I figured, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby recently. That night, I woke up again, this time to a low knocking. Not on the cabin, but faint, rhythmic thuds. I sat up slowly, waited, then heard them again. Not fast, not urgent, just steady, like something brushing or tapping. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed my flashlight again, and slowly opened the door. The woods were pitch dark, and colder than it had been the nights before. I stepped onto the porch and stood still, listening. Then I heard it, a dragging sound. Long, slow, maybe 30 feet to the left of the cabin. I shone the light in that direction and caught something moving just behind a cluster of trees. I froze. The light only reached so far, and whatever was there was just at the edge of it. A tall shape, maybe a person, maybe a deer, but it was standing upright. Then it ducked out of view. I backed into the cabin, closed the door, and sat against it for the next hour, flashlight in hand, until the sky began to lighten through the windows. I didn't sleep again that night. That morning, I walked out to the spot where I'd seen the shape. There were tracks, boot prints again, and a strange drag mark running alongside them, like someone had been pulling a heavy bag. I followed them for a short distance until they veered off down a hill and disappeared into a shallow creek bed. The water had disturbed the prints, and I lost the trail. I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to admit defeat. I wasn't hurt, and technically nothing had happened. I told myself maybe it was a hunter or trapper passing through. Still, I started carrying my camping hatchet with me everywhere after that. That afternoon, I made a bigger fire than usual and sat outside late, just watching the woods. Every sound made me twitch. The wind rattling dead leaves, the thump of acorns falling, even the call of a barred owl. When I finally turned in, I wedged a chair under the doorknob, just to be sure. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, then a scrape, like something being dragged across the wood floor outside. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stayed there, eyes fixed on the door, listening. Then I heard the faintest click. Metal on metal. The latch. Whoever was out there tried to open the door. I gripped the hatchet, heart thudding so loud I thought it would give me away. But the latch held. A few minutes passed, and then I heard the steps retreating. Not running, just slow, steady steps crunching through the leaves, growing fainter, then gone. When the sun came up, I stepped out, hatchet in hand. The porch had scuff marks, long, wide grooves like something had been dragged across it. And there, sitting right at the edge, was a deer carcass. Its throat was slashed, but not cleanly, more like ripped open. Its legs had been broken. It had clearly been moved post-mortem. There were boot prints around it, fresh ones, deeper than before. Whoever left it wanted me to find it. That was enough. I packed everything in under 10 minutes. Food, water, sleeping bag. I didn't care if I left anything behind. I sprinted to the car, about a quarter mile up the path where I had to park it because the trail was too rough. I didn't look back. The car started without issue, and I drove like hell down the trail, bumping over rocks and ruts. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved road. Then I just kept going straight through to Albany, where I got a motel room and collapsed on the bed, fully clothed, still shaking. I called Ron from a gas station the next day, told him I left early and that I'd mail back the cabin key. I didn't explain. He didn't ask. I never went back. Never found out who was out there or why they were watching me or why they left that deer. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office, but without any damage, without a face. There wasn't much they could do. They said it was probably a poacher messing around. Maybe, but the way it all unfolded, it felt personal. Like I was being watched from the moment I arrived. It's been 4 years now. I still think about it sometimes, especially in the fall. I still hike, still camp sometimes, but never alone and never that deep in. People talk about how peaceful the woods are, but peace can turn on you real fast when you're alone and someone else is out there. Someone who knows the land better than you, who doesn't want you there. That weekend changed how I look at isolation. I went out there to escape people. What I found was a reminder that the scariest I was 31 the year I decided to disappear for a while. Not from anything dramatic, not from the law or someone chasing me. I was just tired. I'd worked construction for most of my 20s, long shifts under the sun, dealing with supervisors who barely remembered your name. My knees were giving out and my back felt older than my dad's. So when I got laid off in late spring of 2019, I didn't look for new work right away. I took it as a sign. I had a bit of money saved, not a lot, but enough to float for a few months if I lived cheap. A guy I knew, Rick, used to hunt in northern Wisconsin, and he told me about a place he'd stayed in, an old hunting cabin near Lac View Desert, barely an hour from the Michigan border. He said it was rustic, had no cell service, and nobody went near it after the snow melted because there wasn't much game around. It belonged to a friend of his uncle's or something. He said I could probably rent it for next to nothing if I called the owner directly. So I did. The guy didn't care much. He said if I wanted to give him $400 for the month and not burn it down, the key was under a cement frog by the door. So I packed up my old blue Tacoma with canned food, fishing gear, some tools, and a couple of paperbacks. I didn't bring a laptop. No internet. That was the point. I was going to go off the grid for a while. Just get away from all the noise. I drove up in early June. It took me almost 8 hours from my apartment in Madison. I'd never been that far north before, and the last hour of driving was nothing but trees. The paved roads turned into cracked gravel, and eventually into what felt like trails. I passed a few old houses that looked like no one had lived in them since the 90s. Faded mailboxes with names I couldn't pronounce, old trucks rusting into the earth. The cabin was farther out than I thought. It wasn't even marked. I had to turn off onto a trail that was barely wide enough for my truck. The trees were so close they brushed the sides as I drove in. When I finally got there, it was smaller than I expected. One story, maybe 20 feet wide. It had a screened porch out front and a metal chimney sticking up from the back like a bent finger. The woods around it were thick and alive. The kind of alive that's almost loud. Insects, birds, whined through leaves. I liked it immediately. I found the frog, got the key, and opened the door. The inside smelled like wood smoke and old leather. There was one big room with a stone fireplace, a dusty green couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a kitchen area with a propane stove and a dented fridge that didn't work. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a small bathroom with no mirror and a dry toilet I'd have to empty into a compost bin outside. There was a small window in the bedroom that looked out toward the woods behind the cabin. I set my bags down, cracked a beer, and sat on the porch. The only sounds were birds, the creak of trees, and the distant buzzing of bugs. No cars, no people. It was perfect. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings fishing at a small stream I'd found about a half-mile from the cabin. I'd pack a sandwich, bring a folding chair, and sit by the water for hours. I didn't catch much, but I didn't care. I wasn't there for that. I'd read a lot, took naps, cooked beans and rice on the propane stove. Once or twice, I saw deer in the distance, and one morning I spotted a black bear, just lumbering across the path, not bothering with me. I kept my food sealed tight after that. By the second week, though, things started to shift a little. Not anything big, not at first. Just small details that didn't feel right. The first thing was the footprints. There was a clearing out behind the cabin, maybe 30 feet from the back door. I used it as a spot to dump compost and trash. One morning, I walked out there with a bucket of food scraps, and I saw boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. These were deep, with a square heel and a thick tread. I wore sneakers or sandals every day, nothing that would leave a print like that. And these were fresh, pressed into the damp earth like someone had walked through just that morning. I looked around, called out once, but of course there was no answer, just trees and brush. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the property. There wasn't any fence or anything, but I figured maybe someone had been hiking. It was public land past a certain point. Still, it didn't sit right. I didn't sleep well that night. The next few days were quiet again. I tried to forget about it. Then on Thursday, I went to grab one of my tackle boxes from under the porch, and it was gone. I was sure I'd put it back. I remembered placing it beside the bucket with extra fishing line. Now it was just gone. I thought maybe I'd left it by the stream, but when I walked down there, nothing. I checked all around the cabin. Nothing. I kept my truck locked, but I checked that too. Nothing. Now I started to get that feeling. You know the one. Like someone's been in your space. Like the air has changed and doesn't belong to you anymore. That night, I sat up late, reading on the porch with a lantern. I kept listening for sounds, for movement. A few times I thought I heard something. Sticks cracking, a low shuffle in the trees, but it could have been anything. Could have been a raccoon. Could have been the wind. But the next morning, I found something that made it all feel real. On the window outside the bedroom, on the outside, was a greasy handprint, full-sized, right in the center of the glass, like someone had leaned forward and pressed their palm flat against it. 5 fingers, smudged with dirt or oil. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I hadn't seen or heard a single car since I got there. No visitors, no neighbors, no reason anyone would be out here. It was too far, too hidden. Whoever left that handprint knew I was here. They'd come up close to the cabin. They'd looked inside. That day, I cleaned the rifle I'd brought. I'd only used it once for target practice, but now I loaded it and kept it beside the bed. I didn't sleep well again. Every sound outside made me sit up, heart pounding. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. I didn't go to the stream anymore. I stayed close. I kept the doors locked. I peered out the windows before stepping outside. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker, some random weirdo passing through. But then came the worst night. It started like any other. I ate dinner, just beans and eggs, and sat on the porch until the sun dipped low. The light in the woods went orange, then blue, then gone. I went inside and locked the door. I turned off all the lights and laid in bed with the rifle beside me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. No loud sound, no dream. Just that sharp, silent, kind of waking where your brain tells you something's wrong. The window was open. I never opened that window. It was small, hard to crank, and didn't have a screen. But now it was cracked open an inch, just wide enough to let in cold air. I sat up in bed and stared. The moonlight made the room glow pale blue. My heart thudded like a drum. And then I saw movement. A shape just outside. Not a face, not a clear figure. Just something there, low and hunched. Like someone crouched beside the cabin wall, just beneath the window. Waiting, listening. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat frozen, staring at that inch of black space between the window and the frame. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. After what felt like forever, the shape shifted. It stood slowly, like someone pushing up from a crouch. And then it moved away. I didn't hear it walk. I just saw the shadow slide out of view. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink, I think. I sat up until morning, holding the rifle, eyes locked on that window. When it was finally light, I walked outside. There were more prints in the dirt now. Not just in the clearing, *right outside the window. Deep and messy, same boots. And on the side of the cabin, scratched into the wood with something sharp, was a line. Just a single horizontal gouge, as long as my arm, carved low into the wall. Like someone had dragged a knife or a key straight across it. That was it for me. I packed that day, shoved everything into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't care about cleaning. I didn't care about the trash. I just needed to get out. I didn't even go back to lock the door. I drove until I hit the main road, then farther until I had bars on my phone again. I pulled over in front of a gas station and just sat there, letting my hands stop shaking. I didn't report it. What could I say? That someone was near my cabin? That I saw a shape in the night? There was no proof, no faces, no names. Just tracks and a handprint. I never went back. Later, I told Rick what happened. He said the owner of the cabin didn't want to hear about it. Said the guy was old, didn't care, probably wouldn't even fix the window. That was 6 years ago. Sometimes I still dream about that window, about the inch of open space and the shape crouched outside. I still lock every door and check every window, even if I'm just going to bed in my apartment. I wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from people. But the thing is, you never really know who's out there. You think I was 32 when it happened, and I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. The memory always creeps back in when I'm alone in the woods or when I hear twigs snapping at night. It happened in early August 2019. I had taken a few weeks off work after finishing a long and stressful project. I needed a reset, no phone, no emails, no people. So I packed up my gear and drove up to a spot near Arrowhead Lake in Montana, a place I'd been to once before with a buddy 2 years earlier. It's not too popular, not too far off-grid, and there's a small Forest Service road that cuts through thick woods to a hidden clearing near the lake's edge. The road is bumpy, narrow, and barely maintained, but I liked that. Kept the crowds away. I planned to stay 4 nights. I had a big cooler of food, enough water, a good tent, tools, and my old 9mm pistol in the glove box, just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble. I just liked being prepared. I arrived around 4 p.m. that first day, set up my tent under the tall lodgepole pines, and spent the rest of the evening cooking a simple meal over the campfire. Everything felt calm. The woods were quiet, just the distant call of a hawk and the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush. That first night was peaceful. I slept hard, the way you do after a long drive and fresh air. But the next day, things started to feel off, though I didn't realize it until later. I woke early before sunrise. The morning air was cool and damp, the grass wet with dew. I made coffee on my little camp stove and took a walk down to the lake with my mug in hand. There was a low fog hugging the water, and the trees looked like shadows behind it. I didn't see anyone else, which was normal for this spot. You usually don't run into other campers unless it's the weekend. After breakfast, I decided to hike a few miles up one of the unmarked trails behind my campsite. I wanted to scout out a good spot for wildlife watching later in the evening. I carried my day pack with water, some granola bars, and my hunting knife. Not because I was hunting, but because a blade is always useful in the woods. About 2 miles in, I found a ridge that looked out over a small valley. Perfect spot. I marked it on my GPS and turned back. That's when I noticed something strange. A tree near the trail had been carved. Just a small mark, nothing dramatic, but it wasn't natural. It was a thin vertical line about eye level, and below it, a sideways X. It looked fresh. No moss growing in the cut. No weathering. It didn't seem like much at the time. People leave weird signs in the woods sometimes. Could be anything, a hiker marking their path, or even just a bored kid. I didn't give it more thought than that. I got back to camp by early afternoon, ate lunch, read a bit, then hiked back out to the ridge for sunset. It was beautiful. The sky lit up in oranges and purples, and the valley below turned to shadow. I waited until twilight, hoping to spot deer or maybe even a bear in the distance, but nothing came. By the time I got back to camp, it was nearly dark. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. I couldn't figure out why at first. There were no strange noises, no light, nothing obvious. Just this tight feeling in my chest, like something was off. Around 2 a.m., I sat up and listened. Silence. No wind. No insects. Not even the distant hoot of an owl. The silence is what really got to me. Even in the woods, there's always some noise at night. Crickets, leaves rustling, something. But this was dead quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I stayed up another hour just listening, my hand resting on my flashlight, my heart beating a little faster than I wanted to admit. Eventually, I laid back down and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. Near the edge of the clearing where I'd parked my truck, maybe 30 feet from my tent, there were fresh footprints in the soft dirt. Human, adult-sized. They weren't mine. I checked. I wear size 12 boots, and these were smaller, probably a size 9 or 10. And barefoot. The prints came from the woods, stopped near my tent, and then turned around. Just a single set, like someone had walked up quietly, stood there for a while, then slipped back into the forest. I stared at them for a long time. Then I checked my tent, my truck, my gear. Everything was untouched. My food was still there. Nothing missing. I couldn't figure it out. If it was someone trying to steal, why leave empty-handed? Why barefoot? I thought about packing up and leaving. I really did. But I convinced myself it was probably just a weirdo hiker. Maybe high, maybe lost, maybe harmless. I didn't want to overreact. I had driven 6 hours to get here, and I still had 2 nights left. I moved my cooler and food into the truck, locked the doors, and kept my pistol on me the rest of the day. That evening, I didn't hike. I stayed in camp, fire burning bright, just sitting, listening. I thought maybe I imagined the footprints, or they were older than I realized. Maybe it wasn't a person at all. Maybe I just needed more sleep. That night was worse. I lay in my tent with my ears open. I didn't sleep. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard something outside. Not close at first, just footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching dry leaves, getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on inside the tent, but I didn't unzip the door. I just sat still, listening. The steps circled the tent. Once, then again, a full circle. They stopped near the back of the tent. Nothing for a full minute. Then the zipper of the tent moved. Didn't open, just moved like someone touched it, tested it. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then footsteps again, slowly walking away into the trees. I sat there, frozen. I don't know how long I waited. At least an hour, maybe more. I didn't hear anything else. When the sky finally started to lighten, I got up, got dressed, and walked the entire camp perimeter. No sign of anyone. No more footprints. Just silence. That was it for me. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything fast, shoved gear into bags without folding or sorting, and loaded the truck. By 8 a.m., I was ready to go. I sat in the driver's seat, keys in hand, when I noticed something small tucked under my wiper blade. It was a single Polaroid photo, blurry, crooked, but I knew what it was. It was a photo of me, sitting by the campfire, taken from behind the trees. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting. My face was in profile, the firelight on my cheek. I must have been reading. The photo was taken from about 20 feet away, and I never heard a sound. I didn't wait another second. I started the truck and backed out onto the Forest Service road, tires kicking up dust. The road is rough, full of rocks and roots, and I was bouncing so much I thought my gear would fly out the back. I didn't care. I just wanted distance. The drive back to civilization felt like forever. I kept checking the rear view, half expecting someone to follow me. But no one did. I made it to the nearest gas station around noon. I didn't say anything to the guy inside. I just used the bathroom, bought a sandwich, and got back in the truck. When I got home, I looked at the photo again. There was something else in it. In the shadows, behind the trees, barely visible, was a second figure. Hard to see, just a shape, a silhouette. Could have been anything, but I knew. I filed a report with the sheriff's office, told them everything, gave them the photo. They took it seriously, sent someone out to check the area, but I never heard back. A month later, I called to follow up. They told me they didn't find anything. No signs of other camps, no prints, no trash, nothing. The ranger who went out said it looked undisturbed, like no one had been there at all. I still think about that place. I still wonder who was out there, what they wanted, why they watched me, why they took a photo, and why there were two of them. But more than anything, I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I was 32 when I rented that cabin. It was early November 2019. I had just quit my job at a roofing company in Allentown, Pennsylvania, after a stupid argument with the supervisor. He blamed me for damage on a site I wasn't even on. I'd been dealing with that kind of crap for years, and that day something inside just gave out. I tossed my hard hat on the truck seat, clocked out, and never went back. I didn't really have a plan. I had maybe $5,000 saved up, no wife or kids to worry about. My brother tried to talk me into staying with him and his girlfriend in Lancaster for a while, but I didn't want to be a burden or sit on a couch feeling useless. I needed to get out, be alone, clear my head. So I searched online for cabins for rent. Not resorts or anything fancy, just a plain, private place out in the sticks. I ended up finding a listing on some forum. It wasn't even a proper website. This guy named Ron posted that he had an old hunting cabin near Clinton County, about 20 miles outside of a town called Renovo, and he was willing to rent it out for cheap during the off-season. It was rough, no running water, no electricity, just a generator and a propane heater. No cell service either, but I liked the idea of being cut off from everything. I messaged him, wired half the money up front, and got directions to the place. He mailed me an old-fashioned paper map with a hand-drawn route marked in red. That should have been the first red flag. The drive up was beautiful. 2-lane roads winding through hills and dead forests. Leaves were mostly off the trees, and everything had that quiet, gray tone. The kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. Took me almost 4 hours from Allentown. I followed Ron's map exactly, and I found the dirt path he marked after a long stretch past a gas station that looked closed for the season. The dirt road was narrow and full of potholes. My old Ford Ranger shook like hell going up. After about 15 minutes of crawling through the woods, I saw it, the cabin. It was set in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. No signs of other people, no tire tracks except mine. The roof sagged in the middle. The siding was dark wood, cracked in places, and there was a small chimney poking out of one side. A rusted metal shed sat about 30 feet to the right. There was no lock on the cabin door, just a wooden bar you could slide into place from the inside. I stepped in and looked around. There was one room, a cot, a small table with 2 folding chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and some old shelves stacked with canned food and matches. A 5-gallon water jug sat by the wall. Everything smelled like dust and mildew. I unpacked my stuff, just some clothes, a few tools, a bunch of bottled water, and a cooler with food, and set up the cot. There was a little solar lantern on the table, and the generator sat outside behind the shed. I didn't turn it on. I didn't need power just yet. I lit a couple candles, opened a can of beans, and ate straight from the tin. That first night was quiet. The wind rattled the windows now and then, and I heard a few branches snap in the woods, but nothing that really got to me. I didn't sleep great, but I wasn't scared either. Just felt off. I figured it was the isolation. I told myself I'd feel better in the morning. The next few days were mostly the same. I chopped some firewood from a fallen tree nearby, stacked it against the side of the cabin. I spent hours walking through the woods, just trying to kill time. There were no trails, and the forest felt dense and untouched. Every now and then I'd see animal tracks or droppings, but I never spotted anything larger than a squirrel. The weirdness started around day 4. I had gone about a mile into the woods to check out a small stream I found on the second day. I liked the sound of running water. It gave the place a bit of life. But that day, the stream was gone. I swear it. The rocks were there, still wet, but no water. It was like someone turned off a faucet. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty bed, trying to figure it out. Maybe it was seasonal, I thought. Maybe it dried up sometimes. I shrugged it off and headed back to the cabin. But I couldn't find the path. I had been using broken twigs and small stacks of rocks to mark my way back, but they were gone. I retraced my steps, or tried to, but nothing looked right. Every direction looked the same, just trees and more trees. I didn't panic at first. I had a compass in my jacket. I pulled it out, turned west like I always did, and walked for about an hour. When I saw the cabin again, I almost cried. Not from fear, just relief. I didn't like how fast that turned into something deeper, something colder. That night, I didn't light any candles. I just lay there on the cot, eyes open, listening. The wind had stopped. Total silence. Not even bugs. Sometime past midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow ones. Not crunching leaves. More like pressing against them. Like someone trying to walk quiet. I sat up, heart pounding, grabbed the hatchet I kept near the cot. I didn't breathe. The steps circled the cabin. One loop, then nothing. I waited an hour before I moved. I pressed my face to the window but saw only black trees. No flashlight, no sounds, just trees. Next morning, I walked the entire perimeter of the cabin. No prints, no broken branches, nothing to prove anyone had been there. I tried to radio for help that day. I had a little emergency CB radio in my truck. I climbed in, tried every channel. Static. I turned on the truck and considered driving out, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. Maybe I thought I was just getting in my own head. The isolation was messing with me. That night, the generator started by itself. I hadn't touched it in days. It was an old pull-start Honda model. No electric start, no timer. Just suddenly roaring to life behind the shed. I bolted outside with the hatchet. No one there. No footprints. I shut it off and rolled it into the cabin. That thing was heavy, must have been 90 pounds. I locked it inside with me. Next morning, I found all the canned food open and dumped on the floor. Not eaten, just opened and emptied. Clean slices down the side of each tin like someone used a proper opener. My opener was still on the shelf. I packed everything, tossed it all in the truck and started driving down the dirt road. About half a mile in, the path was blocked. A tree had fallen. I got out, checked it. It hadn't rotted or snapped in the wind. It was cut, clean through like with a saw. I hadn't heard any chainsaws or engines. I would have. I backed up, turned around, tried a different route I had seen on the map. It looked promising, just another dirt path heading east. But that ended in a ditch. No way around it. I went back to the cabin. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the table, lantern on, hatchet in one hand, flashlight in the other. I stared at the door. Nothing happened. No steps, no sounds. Just waiting. By the 6th day, I had started writing things down. Notes, times, locations. Trying to make sense of it. I found myself checking the same parts of the forest again and again. I left markings, deep ones. Chipped bark, tied bits of shirt fabric. Every time I walked back, They were gone, like the woods were scrubbing themselves clean. I was running out of food, only a few bottles of water left. I stopped trusting the jug in the cabin. The water tasted weird, like plastic and dirt. I thought about boiling it, but the stove wouldn't stay lit. It would catch, then die out, even with fresh kindling and paper. Day 8, I found footprints, barefoot, human, small, almost child-sized, leading from the shed to the tree line. I followed them for 100 feet. Then they vanished, not like someone turned around, just gone. I moved the cot in front of the door that night, slept with the hatchet across my chest. I dreamed of a face watching me from the window, but when I woke up, nothing was there. On day 10, I tried walking straight west again. I made it farther than before, about 3 miles, I think. I climbed a small ridge and saw something in the distance. A clearing and what looked like a road. Real road, asphalt. I ran, sprinting through brush, thorns ripping my pants, branches slapping my face. But when I got to the clearing, it was just more woods. No road, just a shadow playing tricks. I screamed, loud, over and over. My throat felt raw. I didn't care who heard me. I slept in the truck that night, windows up, doors locked. When I woke up, there were smudges on the passenger side window. Handprints, not full ones, just greasy smears like someone leaned against the glass. That morning, the key to the cabin was gone. I had left it in the ignition, nowhere to be found. The door was wide open. Inside, every item was stacked in the center of the room, neatly. My bags, the lantern, the stove, even the empty cans, like someone had made a little shrine. That broke me. I left everything, grabbed my wallet, I had been planning this solo camping trip for a while. Work had been stressful, and I needed some time alone in the woods to clear my head. I chose a remote location deep in the forest, far from any marked trails. I didn't want to deal with other campers. I wanted silence, just me and nature. The drive was long, taking me through winding mountain roads before I reached the rough dirt path leading to the forest. I parked my truck at the end of the trail, grabbed my gear, and started hiking in. The plan was simple. Hike about 10 miles in, set up camp by a small river I had seen on the map, and spend a few nights unwinding. I had packed enough supplies, food, water, a sturdy tent, and my hunting knife, just in case. The hike in was peaceful at first. The air smelled like pine, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I felt good, away from the noise of the city. But about 5 miles in, I started feeling uneasy. There was no obvious reason for it. No strange noises, no signs of anything off, but something about the silence felt wrong. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and boots crunching against the dirt. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but that feeling of being watched never left. I reached the river just before sunset and quickly set up my tent. The river was exactly as I had imagined, calm, clear, and surrounded by thick trees. I filtered some water, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the moment. As darkness settled in, I felt that uneasiness return. It was too quiet. Normally, you'd hear owls or crickets by now, but there was nothing. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was being paranoid. I crawled into my tent and forced myself to sleep. A sound woke me up in the middle of the night. It was faint, like something moving through the trees. I lay still, listening. It wasn't the wind. There was a deliberate pattern to it, like footsteps. Slow, careful steps. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. About 30 feet from my campsite, there were footprints. Human footprints, barefoot. They circled my tent. Someone had been here watching me while I slept. I packed up immediately. My plan was to leave right away, but as I looked at the trail I had come from, something felt wrong. The footprints weren't just near my tent. They led back into the forest. And worse, they weren't alone. There were more prints now, like multiple people had been walking around. The realization sent a chill through me. I wasn't alone out here. I kept my knife in my hand as I started walking back. I moved quickly, but carefully, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. Every now and then, I heard something, branches snapping, faint rustling in the distance. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was following me. I forced myself to stay calm. Running would be a mistake. I could twist my ankle, get lost, or make too much noise. But I picked up my pace, my heart pounding. The sounds behind me grew louder, more frequent. Whoever they were, they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a tree ahead of me was a bundle of sticks tied together with what looked like old, rotting fabric. It wasn't random. It was placed there, meant to be seen. I didn't stop to examine it. I kept moving, my breathing sharp and fast. The sounds behind me turned into full-on footsteps. They were running now. I could hear multiple sets of feet crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I was being hunted. I broke into a sprint. My lungs burned. My legs screamed at me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The sounds behind me were getting closer. I knew I had only one chance: get to my truck. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the break in the trees. My truck was still there. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. As I yanked it open and jumped inside, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the trees. I didn't see a face, just a shape, a dark figure stepping back into the shadows. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and peeled out of there so fast I nearly skidded off the dirt road. My hands were trembling. My heart felt like it was about to explode. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road. I never went back to that forest. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Someone had been waiting in those woods, watching, following, and if I had stayed another night, I don't think I would have made it out.